Before we dive in, drop a quick hi in the comments. It may seem small, but trust me, it really helps YouTube share this story with more sci-fi fans like us. I'd love to see who's watching.
The bar on Station Perdix had no windows, because stations this far out in the carrion belt learned early that visibility was a form of vulnerability. Passing ships did not need to know where you were. Passing inspectors did not need to know what happened inside. What mattered was that the doors sealed properly. The air recyclers functioned often enough to keep people breathing, and that enough armed men occupied the room at any given time to make violence an expensive decision for everyone involved. The recycled air carried the faint metallic taste of engine coolant. The lighting stayed low enough that faces blurred at the edges, and intentions became harder to read. By most measures, it was exactly the kind of place. T-Rex had spent the better part of 15 years ensuring nobody associated him with his real name. Everybody on Perdix knew him as T-Rex. He had been at the poker table for 2 hours and 11 minutes, which was long enough for the 4 men across from him to begin arriving at the same conclusion by 4 slightly different routes. The money they had brought to the table was not leaving with them. The broad-shouldered cargo hauler directly opposite him had not reached that conclusion yet. Brist wore his success openly. 3 heavy rings on his left hand, a jacket worth more than most shuttle engines, and the relaxed confidence of a man who believed probability eventually corrected itself if you waited long enough. His thumb moved against the edge of his cards in a slow, circular motion that T-Rex had seen before on 100 stations around 100 tables. It was the gesture men made when they believed the next hand would restore balance. That phase was always the profitable one, but also never lasted as long as they thought it would. He played the way he did everything, with patience wrapped in performance. Enough charm to keep the table comfortable. Enough small losses early to establish the fiction that he was the kind of man who played on instinct rather than calculation. A laugh at the right moment. A self-deprecating shake of the head when a bluff didn't land. By the end of the first hour, he had built the table a version of himself they felt they understood, and that version was useful and wrong in equal measure. The men across from him were not stupid. That was the thing people always misunderstood about what T-Rex did. He didn't take money from stupid men. Stupid men got lucky in ways that didn't follow the math, and they made the whole exercise unprofitable. He took money from intelligent men who had been given a slightly incorrect picture of the situation and made perfectly reasonable decisions based on it. He was, in the most technical sense, a man who created situations and then lived inside them. The hand he was currently holding would have ended the evening cleanly. 3 of a kind. High. Brist across from him was sitting on something he believed in. T-Rex could read it in the movement of the man's thumb against the edge of his cards. A small circular motion that meant comfort, that meant certainty. Whatever Brist had, he thought it was enough. It wasn't. T-Rex had counted the visible cards across 4 hands, and Brist's tell had appeared in exactly the same circumstances twice before, both times when he was holding less than he thought. The device in his coat pocket vibrated once. Nothing else came through that channel. Nothing ever had, except Sheridan. He didn't reach for it. He let 1 full round of betting complete, matched the raise without enthusiasm, and then he looked at his cards again, as if reconsidering something he should have seen earlier. He let the hesitation sit for exactly the right number of seconds, long enough to look like doubt, short enough to look like a man overriding his better judgment with ego. Then he pushed the rest of his chips to the center of the table with the particular energy of someone who has just made a decision they will regret. Brist called immediately, laid his cards down with the satisfaction of a man who has been waiting 2 hours for this exact moment. Full house. He was already reaching for the pot before T-Rex had finished turning his cards over. "Well," T-Rex said, and the grin that followed was genuine enough that nobody at the table looked twice at it. "There it is." He stood, stretched, and extended a hand across the table to Brist, with something that looked enough like good sportsmanship that the man actually laughed and shook it. T-Rex pulled on his jacket, picked up the modest remainder of his chips, enough to make leaving look like a choice rather than a defeat, and on his way toward the bar, dropped a comment about the recycled air tasting worse every year that got two of the remaining players laughing. Behind the counter, a cadron named Sol was wiping down a glass that was already clean. Sol had been wiping the same glass for approximately 4 minutes. He had also been watching the poker table for the better part of 2 hours, because Sol had run this bar for 11 years, and he knew what a controlled table looked like, and he knew what it looked like when a man decided to stop controlling it. T-Rex leaned against the bar and set his remaining chips down without looking at them. He pulled the device from his coat pocket with no particular urgency. One message, no sender identification, a single line of text. He read it once, and then he put the device away. He looked at Sol. Sol looked at him. "Keep them," T-Rex said, pushing the chips across the bar. He walked out. The door closed behind him. Sol set the glass down. Across the room, Brist was still laughing, stacking chips, accepting the congratulations of the other players with the expansive generosity of a man who believes he has just outplayed someone. Sol looked at the door one more time and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say about a man who throws a winning hand without blinking the moment something more important arrives. In 11 years behind this bar, Sol had seen men walk away from money for anger, for fear, for love, for stupidity. He had never seen a man walk away from money like T-Rex just had, cleanly, without hesitation, without a single backward glance, as if the chips had already stopped being real the moment that message came in. Whatever that message said, Sol decided, he was glad it hadn't been sent to him. That message had been sent 2 hours and 17 minutes ago. By the time T-Rex read it, Admiral Cormac Sheridan was no longer sending messages to anyone. 400 meters beneath the surface of Orc 10, in a command center carved from bedrock and reinforced with layered composite plating, Admiral Cormac Sheridan stood in front of a tactical display that covered the entirety of the wall before him and showed him nothing he wanted to see. The Reinder fleet had achieved full orbital position 40 minutes ago. 31 capital ships, 14 carrier-class vessels, an escort screen built for a war they believed would be decided in days. They had come for Scythar Rock, the structure buried 600 meters beneath the desert floor that humanity had found 14 months ago and refused to surrender. Everything else on Orc 10 was secondary to that objective. The ointment facilities, the mining infrastructure, the colonial population. These were complications to be managed, not threats to be respected. The Reinders had given humanity this planet as payment for fighting alongside them in the 100-Day War, a settlement that had satisfied everyone at the time, since no other species had wanted a storm-racked desert world, and humans had accepted it specifically because of a native plant that no one else had known what to do with. Sheridan was a lean man, gray at his temples, with the quality of stillness that senior commanders either develop or don't, with very little middle ground between the two outcomes. He had been on Orc 10 for 9 years, longer than most, shorter than a few, and the planet had done to him what it did to everyone who survived it long enough. It had stripped away the parts of his thinking that required comfortable conditions to function and left behind something harder and more economical. He did not waste movement. He did not waste words. He looked at problems the way a man looks at terrain he is about to cross in the dark, not with fear, but with the concentration of someone who knows that the details are the difference. He had sent the message to T-Rex 4 hours ago. One line. No signature, because no signature was necessary. The only person who received messages from that particular device was the only person who would know what the line meant and what to do about it. Their friendship was old enough and strange enough that it operated on its own frequency, entirely separate from rank or protocol, or the considerable distance that currently existed between a smuggler on a pirate station in the Carrion Belt and an admiral 400 meters underground on a planet about to be invaded. Sheridan had not sent the message because he expected T-Rex to affect the battle for Orc 10. He had sent it because the battle for Orc 10 was not the only war being fought, and T-Rex was the only person alive who could fight the other one. The display showed the first wave of Reinder dropships beginning atmospheric entry on the northern approach, exactly where the projections said they would come. The northern approach made tactical sense. Relatively stable terrain by Orc 10 standards, lower storm frequency on the surface charts the Reinders had access to, proximity to the Sithar Rock excavation site. Sithar Rock was the reason for all of it. Not the ointment, though the ointment carried its own strategic weight. The native plant grew only in Orc 10's specific combination of mineral soil and radiation-filtered atmosphere, and human xenobiologists had spent years adapting the formula species by species until it treated wounds across a dozen alien physiologies. It stopped hemorrhage on contact, closed deep tissue damage in minutes, and killed infection so effectively that battlefield surgery had become almost routine for the governments wealthy enough to trade for it. The ointment was profitable. It was strategically significant. It was the reason Orc 10 had gone from a planet nobody wanted to a planet nobody could afford to ignore. But Sithar Rock was something else entirely. They had found it 1 year ago, 600 meters beneath the desert floor, during a routine ore survey that had stopped being routine the moment the drill head encountered a structure composed of materials that did not occur naturally anywhere in known space. The xenoarchaeologists had taken 6 months to understand what they were looking at. A gateway. Not a theoretical construct, not a damaged artifact of uncertain function. A functional transit mechanism capable of opening stable passages to regions of space entirely beyond current navigational reach. One structure on one planet that humanity controlled but had not yet learned to operate. After humanity understood what Sithar Rock was, the political sequence had unfolded with brutal speed. Sora Den, the Reinder High Commander who had fought beside humanity during the 100-Day War and treated the Alliance as a matter of honor, disappeared 6 months ago when his shuttle failed to arrive at a scheduled diplomatic transfer point. Official investigations produced nothing conclusive. Baron Sul, the leader who replaced him, had grieved immaculately and publicly. The demand to surrender Orc 10 and the Gateway followed 72 hours later. Diplomacy continued for a time in the formal sense, with statements and months of negotiations moving back and forth across secure channels, while both governments prepared for the outcome they already expected. Then the fleet arrived. They came in hard and fast on the northern approach, 40 dropships in tight formation burning through the upper atmosphere, with the confidence of a military force that had run this insertion pattern in simulation hundreds of times and believed the simulation matched the reality. They were disciplined and precise. They were exactly what a professional invasion force looked like when it believed the opposition was not worth adjusting for. Commander Morrow watched them descend through the thermal imaging array from a position buried so deep in the canyon wall that the rock above him was warm from the day's heat, and the rock below was cold from everything beneath. He waited until the formation was fully committed to the corridor. Then, he gave the order. The canyon walls came apart in sequence, not a collapse. A directed fragmentation engineered for this formation width, this descent speed, this altitude. Compressed rock and charged debris crossed the corridor in overlapping horizontal waves. Most of the formation never had time to react. A handful of ships at the rear pulled hard on emergency thrust and cleared the upper threshold before the secondary charges fired. Of those, only 2 made it to open air. Both were damaged. One came down hard on the northern hardpan, and the infantry unit that had been dug into a covered position for 19 days walked out of the sand and secured it before the dust settled. The other made 6 kilometers before losing thrust and going into a dune field, nose first. Morrow counted his dead, while his people pulled back to the secondary positions. 3. 2 from a charge emplacement that had detonated 11 seconds ahead of sequence and caught the edge of a covered trench. 1 from dropship debris that had cleared the canyon wall and come down on a position that should have been safe. He knew all 3 names before the casualty report finished compiling. On Orc 10, you usually knew the names. People survived here too long together not to. For a moment, he stood over the thermal display and let himself feel the shape of the loss. Brief, controlled, but real. Then he filed the report in the same flat operational language every commander on Orc 10 eventually learned to use, because the next formation was still coming, and the planet had never once cared whether the men fighting on it had time to grieve properly before it demanded something else from them. 30 kilometers southwest, Commander Yael Drast had 14 ships coming at him, and orders designed to make the battle look weaker than it was. He had acknowledged the order without hesitation, and immediately started repositioning his people around Sector 9. Sector 9 held 200 infantry, 6 buried artillery positions, and a tunnel access point into the Eastern Fortress network. More importantly, it held 8 years of Yael Drast's accumulated understanding of Orc 10, enough time to learn that the planet rewarded patience, punished assumption, and killed people who confused surviving with being safe. At the center of the position sat the facility itself, processing bays, cultivation chambers, extraction infrastructure, everything built around the plant that had turned Orc 10 from a forgotten colonial, holding into one of the most strategically valuable worlds in human space. That importance complicated everything. Baron Sewell would probably want the facility intact, which meant the Reinders coming in would try to take it carefully, rather than destroy it from orbit. Careful attackers were predictable in useful ways, but they were also harder to bleed correctly. Reckless armies ran into traps. Careful ones probed, adjusted, and slowed down the moment something felt wrong. Drast needed them confident enough not to slow down. 3 ships landed. He had already positioned his people to make that landing look like a breakthrough. The Reinder infantry coming off the ships moved well. They spread from the landing zone in tight tactical formations, secured their perimeter, and advanced toward the outer facility structures with the smooth coordination of soldiers trained for exactly this kind of seizure operation. Drast gave them ground deliberately, pulling his people back through the outer structures in the pattern of defenders losing space under pressure, while maintaining enough resistance to make the retreat feel earned instead of staged. The fighting was real anyway. 4 of his people went down during the withdrawal. 2 died in the outer structures. 2 more took wounds severe enough that they should have been out of the fight entirely, but the ointment sealed the damage quickly enough to get them moving again within minutes. On another world, the retreat might have collapsed there. On Orc 10, men learned to keep moving through pain because stopping was usually worse. The Reinders pressed harder as the defenders gave ground. Drast watched their confidence build exactly as Sheridan had predicted it would. He let them come within 200 meters of the primary processing bay. Then he triggered the buried artillery. 6 concealed positions opened fire in coordinated sequence, their targeting solutions calculated weeks earlier for the exact approach corridors the Reinder infantry had chosen. The first barrage tore through the forward element, crossing open ground between the outer structures and the facility wall. The second struck the units trying to reposition back toward the landing zone. The third hit the ships themselves, 2 of the 3 still grounded, engines not yet cycled for emergency lift. The battlefield changed immediately. What remained of the Reinder force on the ground pulled into cover and stopped advancing. Above them, the 11 remaining ships held altitude, rather than descend into an artillery envelope they could not yet map. Drast watched the landing zone burn for a moment before filing his report. 6 dead. 11 wounded. 4 already back in combat rotation. The outer structures remained contested. The facility itself was intact, The Reinder force inside the perimeter had been contained. Aboard the 7th Dun, Fleet Commander Orath Sel stood at the observation deck, with his hands folded inside the sleeves of his gold robes, and studied the surface reports, arriving from Orc 10, with the controlled stillness of a commander, forcing his thoughts into order before anyone around him could see the disorder underneath them. 40 dropships assigned to the Northern Assault had committed to the canyon approach. 2 had returned. The rest had vanished inside a corridor his insertion models had classified as operationally acceptable. Sector 9 was still active. The separate Southwestern Assault Group had established a foothold inside the outer facility structures, but the engagement no longer resembled the seizure operation his planners had projected. Human artillery positions had opened from locations that did not exist in the intelligence survey. Orath Sel looked at the data feeds again. Then he looked out through the observation port at the planet itself. Copper deserts, red storm systems, vast distances that concealed more than they revealed. Orath Sel had commanded 3 planetary insertions during his career, all successful. He understood that the opening phase of any operation produced friction, environmental variance, communication delay, equipment degradation, the countless small distortions that emerged when a plan encountered reality. Experienced commanders learned to separate ordinary friction from structural failure. The northern approach was not ordinary friction. 38 ships did not disappear into a canyon because of atmospheric variance. His lead commander had assessed the approach as stable enough to continue. The assessment itself had been rational. What disturbed Orath Sel was that the outcome no longer appeared connected to the assumptions that had produced it. That meant the assumptions were wrong. "Pull the pre-insertion survey of Sector 9, he said. "Overlay it with the artillery positions reported by the ground element." The tactical officer complied immediately. The survey appeared across the display wall. Orath Sel studied it in silence. The artillery batteries were not there. The positions from which the humans had opened fire registered only as subsurface mineral density formations, ordinary geological features consistent with Orc 10's terrain profile. Unremarkable. Unflagged. Invisible to anyone who did not already know what had been buried beneath them. "How old is this survey?" he asked. 14 months, Fleet Commander. Compiled before the Sithar Rock discovery." 14 months? He looked at the display again and understood something important with sudden clarity. The problem was not that the intelligence was inaccurate. The problem was that the intelligence described a planet that no longer existed. Humans had controlled Orc 10 for 9 years. 14 months was enough time to reshape entire military infrastructures, conceal fortifications beneath the surface, and bury them inside terrain profiles classified as natural formations. And if Sector 9 contained defenses this extensive, then the rest of the planet likely did too. For the first time since achieving orbital position, Orath Sel considered the possibility that the invasion itself had been anticipated, long before the fleet launched. "Pull the southwestern element back to holding altitude," he said. "No additional insertions until we have current surface intelligence." He paused for a moment. "And get me a full sensor pass on the Sithar Rock excavation site, whatever resolution the conditions allow." The tactical officer acknowledged the order. Orath Sel turned back toward the observation port. In the underground command center, Sheridan read Morrow's report, then Drast's, then the intercepted signal traffic confirming that Orath Sel had lost 38 ships. The intercepts also confirmed something equally important. The Reinder fleet remained in orbit, but no retaliatory strike was coming. He spent only a few moments on the details before isolating the conclusion that mattered. Orath Sel was adapting. The moment the operational picture stopped making sense, he had stopped feeding forces into it. That told Sheridan 2 things immediately. The Reinder commander was intelligent enough not to panic, and disciplined enough not to let momentum make decisions for him. Those were dangerous qualities in an opponent, because they meant Orath Sel would eventually reconstruct the truth of the battlefield if given enough time to study it. Sheridan intended to stay ahead of that process. He looked again at the display wall. The northern approach was closed. Sector 9 remained stable. For the moment, the invasion had lost its momentum and shifted into assessment. That pause was useful. It was also temporary. Sheridan opened a channel to the Eastern Tunnel network and began issuing orders. The orders moved through the hardened relay network beneath the desert, clean and immediate, carried through infrastructure. Humanity had spent years building under the assumption that one day someone would come for Orc 10. Above them, the planet continued exactly as it always had. The storms moved, the heat climbed, the desert reshaped itself by degrees too small to notice until the landscape was no longer the same landscape at all. T-Rex had been on Station Vile for 2 days, which was long enough to learn 3 things about the man sitting across from him that the man would have preferred he not know. The informant called himself Process. Not a name, a function. He moved cargo through neutral space along routes that officially did not exist, which meant he had access to manifests, facility logs, and transfer records for installations that were not supposed to appear on any official registry. He was also, T-Rex had established through a conversation with a dock supervisor on his first night aboard the station, 2 months behind on protection payments to a Cadron syndicate that had very specific ideas about what happened to people who fell behind. T-Rex had not mentioned this. He had simply let it sit in the space between them while Process talked, the way you let a card sit face down on the table when you already know what it is. "The facility is on Dura Ven," Process said. He was a small man, narrow through the shoulders, with the careful stillness of someone who had learned that drawing attention was usually the last mistake people made in his line of work. Private contract, not Rinder military, civilian security firm out of the Karath Expanse. 40 personnel, maybe less. The place is registered as a mineral survey installation. How many interior checkpoints? 3 that I know of. The holding level is below the survey infrastructure. Single access corridor, 1 way in and 1 way out. Ventilation? Process looked at him. "You are going in alone." T-Rex ignored the remark. Process looked at him for another moment, and then continued. "There is a maintenance shaft running parallel to the access corridor on the eastern side. It was built to spec for the survey cover, functional enough to pass inspection, not actually used for anything. It connects to the sublevel at a junction point approximately 30 meters from the holding cells." T-Rex picked up his drink, finished it, and set the glass down without urgency. "The syndicate you owe," he said. "I know the collections officer. If this is clean, I will have a conversation with him." He slid a credit stick across the table. "The rest is money." Process blinked twice, surprise breaking briefly through his composure before he brought it back under control. The debt was not public knowledge. Very few people knew the syndicate was carrying him at all. He nodded once, then slid a data chip across the table. T-Rex pocketed it and stood. "If it is not clean," he added pleasantly, pulling on his jacket, "I will not need to have any conversations with anyone." He left Process sitting with that and walked back toward the docking ring where his ship was waiting. On Orc 10, Orath Cell had stopped feeding formations into prepared kill zones and started probing. Smaller elements, multiple vectors, pulling back the moment resistance stiffened rather than pushing through it. He was mapping the human defensive network by touching its edges and recording where it pushed back, building a picture of what was buried beneath the surface one contact at a time. It was slow. It was expensive. But it would work, eventually. Sheridan watched the probe contacts accumulate on the display and understood what he was looking at. Orath Cell was not trying to win ground yet. He was trying to see. "Railgun Platform 3 is going to be visible after the next probe," Lieutenant Adara said from the secondary console. "If they push the southwestern vector another 4 kilometers, They will hit the edge of its thermal signature. I know. If they identify it, they will target it from orbit the moment the interference clears enough for a firing solution. I know. Sheridan looked at the display. Platform 3 covered the approaches to the Sithar rock excavation site. Losing it meant the eastern approaches opened. Opening the eastern approaches meant Orath Cell could put ground forces within 2 kilometers of the gateway itself. Pull it back through Tunnel 7, move it to the secondary position under the ridge. Adara relayed the order. Sheridan stayed with the display. The sector that had gone dark an hour ago was still dark. 12 soldiers from Morrow's northern element, lost in a probe contact heavier than expected. Sheridan read the casualty report once, held his eyes on the sector marker for a moment too long, then moved to the next problem. The next problem was the eastern ridge. Orath Cell's probes were building toward it, with a patience that told Sheridan the Reinder commander had stopped being frustrated and started being methodical, which was a more dangerous quality than frustration by a considerable distance. He opened a channel to Morrow. The eastern probe is going to reach the ridge within the hour, Sheridan said. I need them slowed down before they get close enough to start reading the terrain properly. Take 1 squad through the secondary approach. Hit them once on the ridgeline, then break contact immediately and fall back through Tunnel 2. Do not let them fix your position. A brief pause. That will put the squad exposed on the approach for several minutes, Morrow said. I know, Sheridan said. Do it carefully and keep the squad intact. Understood? Sheridan closed the channel and turned back to the eastern tunnel schematics, already working through the next layer of the defense while the operation ran. The contact report came back 7 minutes later. The probe had slowed and shifted west to reassess the terrain. Morrow's squad had cleared the ridge and withdrawn cleanly before the Reinders could establish targeting. Duraven was a gray world. Not dramatically gray, not the gray of storms or violence, just the flat, exhausted gray of a planet that had never had anything worth looking at and had settled into that fact over several billion years of indifference. The mineral survey installation sat on a plateau above a dry basin. 3 prefabricated structures connected by enclosed walkways. Nothing about it suggesting it was anything other than exactly what it claimed to be. T-Rex came in low from the eastern approach, in a ship that was registered to a shell company, that was registered to another shell company, that eventually connected to a cargo broker who had been dead for 6 years. He put it down in the basin 2 kilometers from the plateau, in a depression that kept the heat signature below the installation's sensor threshold, and he sat in the cockpit for 60 seconds, going through the facility schematic from Process's data chip one final time. Single access corridor, maintenance shaft parallel on the eastern side, 30 meters from the junction to the holding cells. 40 security personnel, maybe less, civilian contract, trained for containment, not combat assault. He checked his shotgun, checked the suppressed pistol on his hip, checked the knife at his back, and got out of the ship. The maintenance shaft was exactly where Process had said it would be, accessed through a utility panel on the eastern exterior wall that was sealed with a lock sophisticated enough to deter casual interference and insufficient to stop someone who had been opening locks for fun since he was 19 years old. T-Rex was inside in 20 seconds. The shaft was narrow and dark and smelled of recycled air and disuse. He moved through it without a light, one hand on the wall, counting his steps against the schematic he had memorized. At the junction, he stopped and listened. 2 voices beyond the wall. Casual. The specific, relaxed cadence of guards who had been watching an empty corridor for weeks and had stopped expecting anything to change. He came through the junction panel fast and low, and the first guard did not have time to register what had entered the corridor before T-Rex was already past the moment of decision. The second guard reached for his weapon and made it approximately halfway before the problem resolved itself. Neither of them made a sound that carried. T-Rex moved down the corridor, 3 checkpoint stations according to Process, The first had been the junction. The second was a security door with a manned station that required a 2-person clearance code. T-Rex reached it, assessed it for 4 seconds, and knocked the door down. The guard who opened it saw a man in civilian clothes with a pleasant expression and a shotgun, and immediately stepped back with his hands visible. T-Rex restrained him quickly, checked the corridor beyond, and moved through. The holding level was below. One more corridor. One more door, this one without a guard station. Just a heavy lock and a monitoring panel showing the cell interior on a small screen. T-Rex looked at the screen. The figure inside was tall, even sitting. Long limbs folded awkwardly on a narrow bunk. Robes that had once been deep purple, now faded and stained to something closer to gray. But the bearing was intact. Even on a prison bunk, diminished and worn by months in a facility that officially did not exist, Sora Den still carried himself like a man who had commanded fleets and treated honor as something structural rather than symbolic. That had not changed. T-Rex opened the door. Den looked up. His pupils expanded immediately to their full diameter. The Rinder stress response, the biological reflex that his culture had learned to read as focus. He studied T-Rex for a moment with the careful attention of a being who had been in this room long enough to have cataloged every detail of it, and was now processing something that did not fit any of those details. "Human," Den said. His voice was rough from disuse, but the register was steady. "Guilty," T-Rex said. "A certain admiral sent me here. Can you walk?" Den stood. He was 2.5 meters of diminished but functional Rinder, and standing he filled the cell in a way the bunk had concealed. "I can walk." "Good, because I only have one plan, and it requires both of us moving quickly." They moved. The 7th Dun had been in high orbit for 19 days when Orath Cell made the decision to move it. The interference envelope generated by Orc-10's compounding storm systems had degraded his targeting resolution to the point where any orbital strike risked hitting the Scythar rock excavation site or the ointment processing infrastructure that Baron Sewell had specifically ordered, taken intact. The probe strategy was building a picture of the surface defensive network, but it was building it slowly, and every probe cost ships and soldiers against an enemy that seemed to absorb losses and continue functioning with an efficiency that his staff could not fully account for. He needed a clean sensor sweep. He needed current surface intelligence at a resolution his systems could not achieve inside the interference envelope. He needed, in short, to move the 7th Dun to a position outside the planet's electromagnetic shadow. It was a reasonable decision. His tactical staff supported it. The risk assessment was acceptable. He gave the order, and the 7th Dun moved. That was a big mistake. Human contingency planning on Orc-10 had prepared for possibilities exactly like this one. The Marines came out of the debris field beyond the planet's shadow in 3 fast insertion craft running without transponders, already committed to their approach vector before the 7th Dun's external sensors had finished recalibrating to the new position. The 7th Dun's point defense systems acquired them at close range and destroyed one of the 3 craft before the remaining 2 made contact with the hull. The boarding action lasted 11 minutes. Rinder crew fought through the corridors with discipline and without panic, falling back through the ship's internal structure in coordinated sections, making the Marines pay for every meter. The Marines paid. They were Orc-10 trained, which meant they had spent years fighting in conditions that were trying to kill them independently of any enemy, and they had developed a relationship with extreme physical duress that was difficult to distinguish from indifference. They moved through the 7th Dun the way they moved through everything, forward, at cost, until the objective was reached. Orath Cell was on the bridge when they arrived. He did not run. He folded his hands inside the sleeves of his gold robes and stood at the observation port and watched the Marines come through the bridge door with the composed stillness of a commander who had already calculated his options and found them exhausted. His pupils were fully expanded. His robes were immaculate. Around him, his bridge crew had stopped moving. The Marine commander, a compact man with blood on his forearm and the flat expression of someone operating well inside their competence, looked at him across the bridge. "Fleet Commander Orath Sel," he said. "Yes," Orath Sel said. "You are coming with us." Orath Sel looked at him for a moment. Then he looked through the observation port at Orc 10 one final time. Copper and red, vast and indifferent, the planet that had swallowed his insertion force and given nothing back. "It appears," he said quietly, "that I am." T-Rex landed on Orc 10 4 hours after the Seventh Dun's capture, in a reinforced underground bay that smelled of machine oil and recycled desert air. Sora Den unfolded himself from the co-pilot seat and set foot on the planet for the first time, and said nothing, which was the correct response to the situation. Sheridan was waiting at the bottom of the landing ramp. He looked at T-Rex first. Old friends, carrying the weight of years and distance, without needing to speak about either. Sheridan held the look for a moment, then turned to Den. Den looked back at him. The deep purple robes were wrecked, carrying the specific degradation of months in a cell that had not been designed for a being of his dimensions. But the eyes were clear. The bearing was intact. The pupils had stabilized from the stress response to something steadier. "Admiral Sheridan," Den said. "High Commander," Sheridan said. The title was deliberate. Whatever Baron Sewell had declared, whatever political architecture had been constructed around Den's disappearance, Sheridan was not going to pretend the rank had transferred legitimately. He said it the way he said everything, without emphasis, without performance. Just the fact of it. Den was quiet for a moment. "You held this planet. We're still holding it." Den looked at the underground bay around him, the infrastructure, the tunnel access points, the equipment moving through the facility with the organized urgency of a military installation in active operations. He took in the scale of what humanity had built here and what it had cost to defend it, and something shifted in his expression. "Then I should not waste your time," he said. They set up the broadcast equipment in the command center. Den stood in front of it in his ruined robes and did not ask for anything different to wear, which told Sheridan something about the man's instincts. The robes were the point. The visible evidence of where he had been and what had been done to him was the point. The broadcast went out system-wide on every open frequency. Sora Den spoke for 90 seconds. He named Baron Sewell directly and specifically. The staged crash, the black site, the war built on a constructed lie. He stated that he was alive. He stated that he was resuming his post as High Commander of the Rinder people. He declared that the fleet above Orc 10 was operating under illegal orders issued by a leader whose authority had never been legitimate. Then he stopped speaking, and the broadcast ended. In the command center, the silence that followed had a particular quality, the silence of action that cannot be taken back, moving outward at the speed of light through every receiver in the system. T-Rex stood at the back of the command center with his arms crossed and his jacket still carrying the evidence of the last 12 hours, and watched Sheridan looking at the displays. "Nice planet," T-Rex said. Sheridan did not look away from the display. "Go sleep somewhere." "I might," T-Rex said, "after I find something to eat that isn't emergency ration." He pushed off the wall and walked out. The door closed behind him with the same quality of silence it always did, a man already moving on to the next thing before the room finished registering that he left. Sheridan looked at the displays for a long time after that. The war had stopped moving. The Rinder fleet still held position beyond the atmosphere, but after the capture of Orath Sel, no new formations entered the surface envelope, and no new orders came down from orbit. Probe elements already on the ground had gone static where they were, holding defensive positions and waiting for command authority to re-establish itself. On the human displays, the battlefield had frozen in place. Above them, Orc 10 continued exactly as it always had. Storms moving across the desert, heat building over the hardpan, the planet itself indifferent to the pause. Sora Den looked different with clean robes and sleep behind him. Not recovered. That would take longer than one night in a human facility could provide. But the specific hollowness that months in a cell produces, the way prolonged confinement compresses a person inward until they occupy less space than their body actually requires, that had begun to lift. He stood at his full height in the corridor outside Sheridan's command center, deep purple robes clean and repaired by someone on Sheridan's staff who had understood without being told that the robes were not a detail. Sheridan had come to him directly after the morning briefing. No preamble, no diplomatic framing. There is a Rinder military commander being held in a secured cell inside this facility, he said. I think you should meet him before we discuss what comes next. Den had looked at him for a moment, with the careful attention that seemed to be his default mode of engagement, reading the space around the words rather than just the words themselves. You are not going to tell me who he is. I think it will mean more if I don't. They walked together through the tunnel corridors, the Admiral and the High Commander, moving through the infrastructure of a civilization that had been built 400 meters underground on a planet nobody had wanted. Den observed it the way he observed everything, quietly, completely, missing nothing. The hardened relay nodes in the corridor walls, the equipment moving through intersecting passages with the organized urgency of a military installation that had not stood down. The soldiers they passed, who looked at Den with the particular expression of people encountering something they had been told about, but had not expected to see in person. Sheridan stopped at a secured door near the eastern junction of the tunnel network. He entered his clearance code, and the door opened. The cell beyond was functional rather than punitive, a room rather than a cage, with adequate light and furniture that fit a being of Rinder dimensions. Orath's cell was standing when the door opened, which suggested he had heard them coming through the corridor and had chosen to receive whoever arrived on his feet rather than seated. His gold robes were clean. His hands were folded inside his sleeves. His pupils were at their resting diameter, which meant he had his physiology under the discipline that 30 years of command had built into him. Then he saw Den. His pupils expanded immediately and completely, the involuntary response of a commander confronting a situation his mind had no prepared category for. Then Orath Cell lowered his head, a deep, sustained inclination, the Rinder gesture of allegiance that was given to legitimate authority and withheld from everything else. High Commander, Orath Cell said. His voice was steady. Den crossed the threshold into the cell and stood before him. He looked at Orath Cell for a long time, with an expression that Sheridan, watching from the doorway, could not fully read. Not anger, not relief, something older and more complicated than either. They told you I was dead, Den said. Yes. Orath Cell raised his head. The investigation produced nothing conclusive. The shuttle telemetry was consistent with catastrophic drive failure. There were no survivors reported. A pause. I had no reason to doubt it. I know, Den said. That was the point of it. Orath Cell was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I prosecuted this campaign under false orders. My soldiers died because I believed them legitimate. His pupils remained fully expanded. I will accept your judgment, High Commander. Den held his gaze. Baron Sewell used your honor against you. The judgment belongs to him, not to you. Sheridan stepped back from the doorway and said nothing. Nothing useful needed adding to the moment unfolding inside the cell. The fleet Sheridan assigned to escort Sora Den back to Rinder space was not symbolic. It was substantial. Enough ships to make the journey a statement that could not be misread by anyone still calculating which way the political situation was going to fall. Morrow would command it. Sheridan had made the decision quickly. The mission required judgment as much as firepower, and Orc 10 had made Morrow the kind of commander who understood when each was needed. Orath Sel would travel with the fleet. Not as a prisoner. That designation had ended the moment Den acknowledged his allegiance as legitimate, but as a Reinder fleet commander, escorting his high commander home. The human ships accompanying them were there to ensure they arrived safely. It was an arrangement no one in either government had expected to exist 3 days earlier. The loading bay was filled with the controlled noise of departure preparation when Sheridan stepped onto the landing pad. Morrow moved through the pre-departure checks with efficiency, signing off on manifests, speaking briefly with his officers, and checking each stage of the loading sequence himself as cargo moved up the ramps behind him. He noticed T-Rex approaching. T-Rex appeared with a container of something hot and the expression of a man who had finally found food that met his minimum standards. "Big send-off," T-Rex said, looking at the loading bay. "Necessary one." T-Rex drank from the container and watched the preparations for a moment. "You know he's going to walk back in there, and the whole thing is going to be a mess for years." "Yes." Political reconstruction. Factions. Everyone who sided with Sewell trying to reframe their position. Another drink. Ugly business. "It is," Sheridan said. "That's his problem to solve. We kept the planet. That was ours." T-Rex considered this with the expression of a man who finds the distinction reasonable, but reserves the right to revisit it later. They stood together on the landing pad while the fleet finished its preparations around them. Two men who had known each other long enough that the silence between them had stopped being empty and become, instead, a kind of conversation that did not require words to carry its content. When the fleet departed 30 minutes later, Sheridan went back to work. Baron Sewell had planned for many contingencies. Officially, Den had died in the shuttle incident. In reality, Sewell had kept him hidden in a black site prison as a final contingency. A broken high commander was still politically useful if the transfer of authority ever required legitimacy that only Den could provide. The facility had been secure. The people running it had been paid well enough to disappear with the secret permanently. Sewell had planned for opposition, investigation, even internal fracture. He had not planned for someone to bring Den back. When the broadcast went out, the foundational assumption, the death of the previous high commander, ceased to be true, and everything built on top of it began to come apart with the speed political structures collapse when their central premise is publicly invalidated, which is always faster than anyone inside them believes possible until it starts happening to them. Sewell had hidden first. There were people who owed him enough to provide concealment, facilities that did not appear on official registries, time to assess the situation and determine whether it could be managed. The loyalist factions that had been waiting for exactly this kind of fracture moved faster than his containment options could operate. And within 72 hours, the political ground had shifted so completely that hiding stopped being viable, and running became the only remaining calculation. He boarded a ship with a skeleton crew and pushed for neutral space on a route that avoided the primary transit corridors and used gravitational threading through the outer system to minimize his detection profile. It was a good route. It had been prepared in advance because Baron Sewell was the kind of man who prepared exit routes in advance, even when he believed he would never need them, which was part of what had made him dangerous. Orath Sel was waiting at the outer system threshold. After returning to Orc 10 and delivering Sora Den safely into human custody, he had spent less than an hour planetside before reopening the intelligence networks that still answered to the old High Commander's authority. Once Den confirmed what had happened, the shape of Sewell's next move became easier to predict. Sewell would run, not through the primary military lanes. Those would be watched the moment the truth spread beyond Orc 10. Not through independent smuggler routes either. Too unstable. too dependent on captains whose loyalty lasted only as long as the highest payment. That left the older outer system threading corridors, quiet transit routes from the early expansion era, lightly trafficked, and distant enough from the main fleet networks to buy time if pursuit came late. Orath Cell knew those routes well. He had studied them as a junior officer and later reviewed them repeatedly while serving under Sewell's administration. More importantly, he knew Sewell. Sewell preferred controlled risks. He trusted systems that looked orderly and conservative because he believed most people failed to examine orderly things closely enough. If escape became necessary, he would choose the route that appeared safest rather than the one that appeared fastest. So Orath Cell chose the corridor Sewell was most likely to believe remained unnoticed. He took 3 ships and went there first. When Sewell's vessel emerged through the outer threshold, it found the interception group already waiting in a containment formation that left no viable exit vector. A single transmission crossed the command frequency. Cut thrust and prepare to receive boarders. The silence afterward lasted roughly 40 seconds. Then Sewell's ship cut thrust. Orath Cell handled the boarding personally. He walked the corridors of the ship with 2 officers behind him and his sidearm still holstered. Crew members moved aside without resistance. Nobody aboard needed the situation explained to them. They found Baron Sewell inside the command compartment. He was still dressed in the deep crimson robes of his office, composed at first glance, carrying himself with the same controlled calm that had allowed him to dominate political chambers for years. Orath Cell stood in the doorway and looked at him for a moment. "Baron Sewell," Orath Cell said, "you are coming with me." Sewell met his eyes without moving. "On whose authority?" "The High Commander Sora Den," Orath Cell said. For the first time, Sewell's composure shifted, the expression of a man understanding that the sequence of calculations carrying him forward for the last 6 months had finally ended. Orath Cell stepped aside and indicated the corridor. Sewell walked past him without another word. A short time later, the ships turned back toward the inner system, carrying the architect of the war home to face the government he had tried to reshape through it. Sheridan was in the command center when Morrow's call came through the hardened relay, clean and clear through 400 meters of rock and the interference of 2 competing storm fronts. "Mission accomplished, sir," Morrow said. "High Commander Den is in Reinder space. His people have him." Sheridan looked at the display in front of him. No fleet contacts in orbit, no probe markers on the surface, just the planet doing what the planet did. "Good work, Commander." "Thank you, sir." A pause on the channel, the specific pause of a man waiting to be dismissed and not quite ready to go. "Come back safely, Morrow," Sheridan said. "All of you." "Yes, sir." The channel closed. Sheridan stayed with the quiet of the command center for a moment, the hum of the relay network, the distant sound of the facility operating around him, the weight of everything that had been spent to reach a morning where the displays showed nothing requiring an immediate decision. T-Rex had left for a settlement on Carthus Vi nearly 2 hours earlier, after claiming the planet had a bar worth crossing systems for, which Sheridan had dismissed immediately and then, privately, considered entirely possible. 600 meters beneath the command center, the excavation around Scythar Rock continued without pause. The scientists working the site had not stopped during the invasion, because the gateway itself changed nothing about what still needed to be done. Humanity understood what Scythar Rock was, a transit mechanism, a gateway capable of opening passages to regions of space no existing navigational system could reach. What humanity did not understand yet was how to use it. Sheridan looked at the tactical display one final time before turning back to the operational reports waiting on his desk. The war for Orc 10 was over, but victory had not simplified anything beneath the surface of the planet. If anything, Scythar Rock had ensured that the difficult part was only beginning.
Hey there, Space Human. I'm really curious about your thoughts on this video. Drop a quick comment and let me know what's on your mind. or just say hi if you prefer. Either way, I'd love to hear from you. Also, remember to check the pinned comment. Trust me, it's worth a look. Oh, and one last thing. I've chosen another video for you to watch. Just click the card here, or here if you want the whole playlist. See you there.